Hey there guys, welcome back. This is going to be the last video in our tooling series for March, and so we're going to go ahead and get started. If you haven't seen the first videos of tooling this pattern, there's a link down in the description that'll take you to a blog post on our website that has all the videos in one place, and there's also going to be a pattern that you can click the link and download this pattern for free. And you can tool along with us from start to finish. Now you can this is cut out of a piece of 13-15 ounce Herman oak leather. You could certainly cut this out of anything you would like as long as it's a veg tan leather. As I suggest in the other videos, I would probably not go down much less than about 9 ounce, but 13-15 does a really good job on here. And if you've got a bunch of scrap leather, this is a perfect little project just to practice, especially with everything going on. And I hope everybody is staying safe. And if you're at home, hopefully you're using this opportunity to, if you can, between kids and working from home and all that, hopefully you can have an opportunity to follow along with this tooling series and work on your tooling skills. So in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and dye and paint this and antique it and finish it up. And it'll be completed. And so we're going to go through here. I decided we're going to do a two-tone black on this just because it's a skull, and a lot of times black and skulls go well together as far as color coordination. And with all the painting that we're going to do on it, it'll make this skull stand out even that much more. So I've got my little thing here. I suggest, as in other of our dyeing videos, making some type of little piece of wood like this with some holes drilled in it. I had a good friend of mine make this for me. He had made himself some, and it really helps to keep you from spilling your dyes. It's just a little hole right there, and these little Dixie cups or these little Jello shot cups here work really well for dye, and that way you only get out what you need and you've got less chance of spilling it. But in this cup here, I've got some black 5-Beings black pro dye, and I've also got, I put a little bit of brown pro dye in there as well, dark brown. You could also do mahogany or anything, just some type of earth tone you want to mix in with your black, because the black tends to run occasionally, even after, not while you're putting it on, but even later on it can creep up onto things. And I find that if you'll mix it with an earth tone like a brown or a mahogany or something like that, it tends to isolate that pigment and keep that black from running quite as bad. And so I would suggest kind of trying that if you are using black or having any trouble with black kind of leaching up on stuff later, then you might try mixing it with some brown. So we're going to get started on this right now, and we'll see how it turns out. All right, guys, so I do have other videos on dyeing stuff, two-toning projects and stuff like that. So, but this is just a long bristled, very narrow brush. I think it's actually considered a flat brush. But it's just really, the bristles on it are really long. I don't really suggest using, as I've said before, one of these short bristle brushes. A lot of people want to go to one of these because you're going to be dyeing really small little areas. The difference is between these two brushes here, as you can see there how long the bristles are in this one, is that's a lot of room for dye to load into the bristles of this brush, versus this one here. It's got about the same amount of bristles, but they're much shorter. So you're going to hold less dye with this brush, and so you're going to have to go back to your dye well more and more often than you will with a brush like this. I've had a couple people ask where I buy these tapered brushes like this. They come straight. Just after a long time of use, you can see how dirty and wore out this brush is. They tend to get a little bit of a taper in them like that. And I really like that, because if you're dyeing something here, you have less of a chance of it touching what you don't want dyed. And so that just takes a little time to train that thing just to get it like that. Like I said, this is a well-used brush. It's been around for a while, and I'll use them until they absolutely die, until they're just no good anymore, and then I'll throw them out. But they're just cheap little brushes I bought at Hobby Lobby. You don't need to spend a lot of money on brushes for this deal, because the dye seems to be really hard on them. And so I would suggest just buying the cheapest brushes you can find, and it'll be fine. But I would suggest a long bristled narrow brush works really great for dyeing. So I'll show you right here. So what I'm going to do is we're going to dip that brush pretty good ways down into the dye and let that dye kind of wick in there. Now you can see how much dye is on that brush. We've got quite a bit of dye on there. Now that may be a little much if you're trying to dye really small portions of background. So I would just really lightly wipe it on the side, and that's going to clear off any excess. But we've still got quite a bit of dye inside those bristles. And so that's going to really help you as far as not having to go back to the dye well as much if you've got a longer brush like that. Now the one thing you want to remember when you're dyeing any kind of dye background or anything like that, is start in the middle of your background piece, because that dye will run. And so you want to start in the middle and then work your way out. That kind of, if you've got a little too much dye on your brush bristles, then it'll let it run a little bit. You don't have to really, you're not painting the background, you're dyeing the background. So if you'll let that dye kind of do its thing and run, it should run up to your bevels in that background. And cover it well. So you don't want to have to, actually painstakingly brush each little piece of background. You're more letting the dye run in the background and fill that area. And now I've dyed enough background in my career that I get a little bit too brave sometimes, and I do make mistakes. I mean, they say I've gotten dye where I don't want it and stuff like that, but I will usually add quite a bit of dye to my brush because I want to dye faster. And so I'll really load it up and then let it run about. But you do how much ever dye you feel comfortable with. I would rather you take longer and do a better job and a cleaner job than trying to get too fast with it and then getting dye where you don't want it. And we're going to two-tone this, so all of this area out here will be dyed black too. But when I two-tone stuff, I do the background first because it's the most tedious. So I go ahead and get that knocked out, and then I'll come in and do the outside with a bigger brush that holds more dye, where we don't have to be quite as careful. But as I'm going around, I'll go ahead and get these little corner pieces where the area is kind of tight in there. I'll go ahead and put some dye in there just so I don't have to worry about it when I come back with a bigger brush. If you've done a good job with your beveling and your beveling's deep enough and crisp enough, you should have no problem with that dye just staying in the background only and not running up onto other elements that you're not trying to dye black. So as you're working on your beveling, always keep that in mind. If you're going to be dyeing something, be sure and do a good job of your getting everything raised up and that background pushed down in there, so that you've almost got like a little holding area for any kind of dye or paint that you might want to do. And that same deal also helps with antiquing. If you're not getting quite the contrast on your antiquing, sometimes that can be that you just didn't bevel really well, or it's not deep enough, or maybe your case was off and the leather was too wet, so your bevel didn't really act appropriately. And so all of these things kind of compound on each other, and finishing a completed piece. So, and you can see as even though we've mixed the brown in with the black, you don't have to put a lot of brown in there. Just, I'd probably say 25%. 1 part brown and then 3 parts black, or you probably even go less. I've gone even less black and more brown. That black is so overpowering that it will actually still look very black. And if you use vinegaroon, you may have no problems, and that's absolutely fine. I've played with it some. I've had some people ask if I've ever messed with that. I have played with it. I've kind of actually tried to make it, and it does work. It stinks pretty bad. So I wasn't a real big fan of that, but normal dye doesn't smell very good either, but it's not quite as potent as that vinegaroon. It seems pretty strong, but it's definitely a really, really neat application and works well. But no more than dye cost, I'll just buy black dye. Now I use 5-ings for all my dye and finishes and stuff. but I do use Angela's paints. I have a bunch of their dyes, and their dyes are really good. And so if you prefer those, that's fine. I know how 5-Ing's dyes work, and because I've always used those, so I've just kind of stuck in that way. But you use whichever dye you prefer. Now I am going to go ahead and dye these eyes black. Just because I think it's going to look pretty cool. But you could certainly paint these eyes whatever color you would prefer. But since I'm here and we're doing a black theme kind of deal on this, I'm going to go ahead and just dye these black. Okay, and I think we've gotten all the little pieces. So now we'll kind of rinse out that little brush. And I'm going to go ahead and grab a bigger brush. This is a bigger bristled. It's a little shorter, but it's really fat, and so it should hold quite a bit of dye as well. And we'll just load that up. Be very careful around our feathers, especially with those little loose pieces that we've finger carved around the edge and did knife cuts to where they're kind of loose and free. Be very careful with your brush, because those are like little soda straws. They'll just suck that black dye up real quick. And this area goes usually really quickly because you can be a little more relaxed going around here, because you're not, it's a big open space and you've got a good bevel around the outside to kind of bump up against. Now the good thing about two-toning something black is that you'll usually only have to do one coat. If you're doing a two-tone brown, if you decide to do this a two-tone brown or some other earth tone color, you'll probably have to do a couple coats. Maybe not necessarily in the background, but around this outer edge, you will probably have to do 2 coats so that it's even. And if it starts looking splotchy or something, just don't worry about it. Just finish one complete round around there and then come back and do it again. And you may even do it a 3rd time. But that's just the nature of earth tones. They tend to need a coat or 2 more, especially depending on the leather that you're using. Alright, so that two-tone job is over now. It's completely two-tone black. We've got all our little pieces of background all around the outside edge. So now we'll be ready to paint. So I'm going to get our little palette ready to go, and we'll come back. So we've got this palette here. This is just a kind of a tray palette I bought at Hobby Lobby. You can use whichever one you like. I've also used those round ones with the little wells. I tend to use them upside down, but yeah, these work good too. But I found this one is just a little easier to clean and works better for the way I work. But what we're going to do first is we're going to give it a coat of white. So what we're first going to do is we're going to put a little bit of white on our palette, and that's going to we're going to concentrate on the feathers first. Now that's about all the white that I put on my palette, and then I will use a little cup of water here, and all I'm going to do is just dip my brush into the water and kind of mix some of this white in here. This is going to thin the paint quite a bit, and I just keep doing that until I get it a really almost a watery consistency. And I heard about this from Aaron at Maker's Leather, and he said that Peter Main uses really, really watered down paint. And so I gave it a shot, and it actually works really well. You will have to do multiple coats to get the colors that you want, but it also seems to help the paint from rubbing off as easily. So if you're, when you go to antique, you'll still lose some color on some, depending on the color it tends to do it less. Now I know this looks a little bit grayed out. I've got a little bit of mud in my brush, which would, mud being just dirty from the dye that we were doing. This is the same brush that we did the outside edge of the two-tone with. But I don't really worry about it because by the time it gets into the leather, it kind of evens out. You obviously want to clean your brush as best you can, but I tend to just kind of deal with it. I want kind of an off-white anyway, so it's not that big of an issue. It's getting pretty close. I try to get it pretty watery. Not quite the consistency of water, but you know, very thin compared to what it is coming out of the bottle. And the paints that I use are just Angelus paints, and you can certainly buy those from Aaron at Maker's Leather, or you can get them from Angelus direct. But if you just want to try them, if you've never used them before, Aaron sells the smaller bottles and whatnot, so you can certainly give those a try. I really, really like these paints. They are better than any of the other paints that I've ever used, so they're the paints that I would recommend for this. And as I brush these feathers, I would like the consistency of this paint to almost act like a dye, to where it's running a little bit. It'll make the coverage a lot faster, even though we have to go over it a couple times. It just seems to kind of strike into the leather a little bit and doesn't sit on top just like a coat of paint. It tends to get absorbed into the leather a little bit more. And I think it leaves a lot more detail to your work and makes it look a lot better than if you just smeared a bunch of thick paint on top. So I'll keep adding water to this if it starts to feel a little thick as I'm brushing these feathers. And if you're getting a lot of see-through in your paint, don't really worry about that too much. We're going to go over it again. And yes, you can certainly use this straight. But like I said, to me, the thick caked on paint just doesn't look quite as good as if you thinned it out quite a bit. Be real careful not to get it on your black areas, because it is paint, so it's going to be hard to get dye to go back through that, you know, to kind of touch up your work. You'll have to probably, on this black, you could use a Sharpie to cover up any paint, or a light coat of just black paint if you do get some of this white off a feather. And right there you can see how much better that second coat looks on that feather. And some of the colors, when you water them down, it may take 4 or 5 coats to get the color that you're looking for. But I do think it's worth it in the long run as far as a finished piece. And remember, we're going to antique this, so you don't have to get too critical about getting all the way down into like these cracks down in here and stuff like that, because the antique will fill a lot of those. You want to get good coverage, but you don't have to get, you know, if you're worried about getting some on the black right there, just get the tops of those little pieces of that feather. And better safe than sorry, because like I said, that antique will cover up a lot of holidays and stuff you've got in there. So I got a little bit of white right there, so sometimes you can scratch that off. So I usually don't try to wipe it off. Just if you get a little dab somewhere, just kind of leave it. Sometimes you can take a little razor blade or the end of your knife or something, and you can sometimes just scratch that off, and it doesn't even appear to have ever been there. You'll also be really surprised at how fast this paint dries, which acrylics dry fast anyway. That's what makes them a really good media for leather. But just as a paint, an acrylic paint dries really quickly. But really, when they're watered down, they dry seems like even faster. So by the time you get all these, the first coat on all these feathers up here, you can go ahead probably right back then and do the second coat. So we've done 2 coats on these. I'm not going to do a full third coat, but you could certainly keep going depending on how bright you want your white on this. I tend to prefer just kind of more of a flat paint color, and like I said, I like to try to keep from putting just globs of paint on there. So the more coats you add, the thicker it's going to get, obviously, of pigment on top of the leather. So I'm going to kind of touch up some of the areas that are a little bit too dull. And then we're going to call it good for now. And we can also touch up after we antique. So you can actually, after you're done antiquing and it's all completed, you can come through here with a paintbrush and real carefully touch up anything that you want to brighten up or something like that. So I'm going to call those pretty good. You can see there, you can still see all those little lines we scratched in there and all our decorative cuts. And so now we'll do these 2 feathers that are hanging down below off his side, off his temples there. So now we'll kind of do those. When you're painting leather, a little thing that I'm starting to learn is that we used to do a lot more painting than we do these days. It seems like it's slowed down just a bit as far as the amount of color people want on their products that we make, but I still get a fair amount of it. But I've started to find out that, like, if you're painting something, a lot of times, depending on the color that you're wanting, laying down 1 coat of white seems to bring everything to neutral on your piece, and then when you put the actual color you want on top of that, you get a little bit more vibrant color. And so I'm still experimenting with it, but you may try that. I know, like with the metallics that Angela sells, I've figured out with like the silver and the pewter, a lot of times if I'll lay down a coat of white first, it looks more metallic and brighter. And so I've been kind of experimenting with that. You may give that a shot. I don't know what it'll do with other colors, as far as like all the colors, but I know a few of them I've done that just so that I get a kind of a better rich color out of what I'm trying to do than just because that leather's, I mean, it's tan or brown, and so it's kind of works its way through sometimes, and laying down a coat of white seems to help. Okay, so we've got all the feathers covered in white, so they're ready to go. We'll let them dry just a little bit. The skull I'm not going to do with white because it's a bone. We're actually going to use a color that Angelus makes called bone. And it is just a really, really dulled out white, almost got some gray in it. And if you study color theory just a little bit on YouTube or on the internet or whatever, you can really quickly realize that you don't need all the paints that I have up here. I've got almost every color that Angelus made at the time when I ordered my first batch from them. I wouldn't suggest doing that. You can really easily make these colors Color theory is really, really interesting, and it's really fun to try to come up with your own tones. The only thing you got to be sure is remember how you created that color if you run out during a project or if you need to replicate that. But since we have it, we're going to go ahead and use it, and I've been using it on a bunch of skull projects we've done, and it works out really well. But the teeth, I am going to paint those white because the teeth are actually, you know, they're bone, but they're really pearly white. I mean, they're bright and shiny white. So just so that they have a little bit of a different tone to them, we're going to go ahead and paint those white while we've got our brush loaded with white here. And that'll just give a little more realism to this piece. And since they're smooth, you're going to notice they're going to paint just a little bit differently. I got a little too much paint on that tooth, so it's kind of welled up in there. So we'll get some of our paint out of our brush here because I don't want to glob it on there. I want to do it just like we did the feathers with a couple coats. But it'll really make those teeth stand out and look different from the rest of the skull. And if you get a little too much paint on something, you can certainly take a little paper towel and just real gently, just don't wipe, just press. And then you can kind of daub some of that off of there. So that's pretty good for now. We might, after we antique it, we might touch that up just a little bit. And so that's all the white I'm going to do. So now I'm going to clean out my brush. I don't have to get too crazy with it because we're going with another type of white here. So now we'll come over here to a new spot on the palette and add just a little dab. I better shake this up. Sometimes some of the colors are thicker than others, and some of them you want to be sure to mix it up. And don't need a whole lot because we're using a lot of water, so we'll just get this. And when I mix these, I don't mix that whole batch. I'm just going to pull some of that paint out and mix it with the water that's in my brush. And you can keep doing that as you're going because we can actually scoop that up and put it back in the bottle if we don't use it all. I don't have much white left. As you can see, we've used almost all of that, but you can see my original bit left from the original daub that we put down there. But that's how I do it. I keep my thick paint here and then just kind of pull in pigment as I need to get to the consistency that I want. And I can adjust it as I'm painting. You know, if we go to put it on, it's a little thick, I can add a little bit more water to just a section of that paint there and then just keep kind of fiddling with it as I'm painting. You don't need to mix a whole batch up and have it sitting there all mixed because it'll begin to dry on you and thicken anyway. So you're always going to have to be adjusting it. And since the skull is really smooth, it tends to take paint a lot differently. And so we want this so we don't see the brush strokes. We want to be sure and keep that paint really thin. If you don't have this bone color, which is probably pretty probable, just mix just a dab of black, just a touch, in with your white, and that'll give you a little dulled out white that should work just as well. Sometimes it's difficult on these smooth, because we smooth pear shaded this and use the modeling spoon on it and all that. Sometimes it's hard to keep your brush strokes out, but it's easy to move the paint around. So if you get a big glob somewhere, you can kind of push that paint around a little bit. Try to use short, fast movement so that your brush strokes will be less visible. But when you burnish that leather the way we did with the modeling spoons, it makes it a little harder for that paint to soak in there. So once I get an initial coat on there, I'll just kind of let that dry for a little bit and then come back over it again. And hopefully that paint will have something to stick to at that point. Like I said, if you get a little too much on there, you can take a paper towel and just kind of dab some of that off. And we're going to let that sit for just a minute and let that kind of dry. So we'll move on to another color here. Get some other things done while we're waiting on that to dry, and then we'll come back and put some more on it. And I'm going to do his headband here. I'm going to do it red. And it's not going to take a lot. So if you're not going to do a lot, you can certainly just take, well, this, if your paint starts to dry out in the bottle, you can, because if you get down where you don't have a whole lot in there, you can certainly put some water in the bottle, just a little bit, and then shake it up real good. And you ought to be able to get some out of there. So I'm just going to take this lid here. I'm just going to grab a smidge of this paint and put it on our palette, because we're not going to need a bunch of that red. What we're doing is the headband. So then I'll take some water and just thin that down, just like we've been doing. When you start using water and thinning these paints, you'll really be surprised how little paint it takes to do your projects. And obviously you pick whatever color you want for all these things here. I'm just doing kind of whatever I feel at the moment on this deal. That's about all I'm going to do with the red. You can see in this palette how you start taking up a lot of space, using different colors, but it makes it really easy to clean up and gives you plenty of room to be able to kind of work on what you're doing without worrying about it too much. Now I'm going to take an orange. I'm going to choose an orange here for some of these beads, and I'm just going to grab just a little bit out of the cap, get a little water on there. I'm going to do these little rings here on the side in this orange color. I've always thought this orange looks really, really good on leather. Orange and brown goes really good together. And then I'm going to come and skip a bead. Skip another one. Do the same on this side. Now we'll pick another color, clean our brush, and probably throw a little purple. Just get a smidge of just some straight purple there, and we'll do those other beads with purple. All right, let that sit and dry. Now we'll come back to our bone color here. We'll try our second coat and see how this goes. Just gotta kind of keep painting on it till it gets the color we want, and see less and less of that leather poking through. Even though this color is really close to white, it may have been better to lay down a coat of white onto this, just because that pigment seems to coat a little bit better, and then gone over it with the bone, but we'll make it work. It's just going to take a few more coats. So we'll let that dry. And now we'll start detailing these feathers. Now this is kind of, I'm just going to do what I usually do on feathers, which is going to be a turquoise color in there, and that's going to add to our detail. So I'm going to paint the tips of these feathers with the turquoise, and then we'll also add some spots in there, and I'll show you what we're going to do. And I do a lot of feathers this way. Turquoise and white seem to really stand out and look good. I've done these on belts for guys, for girls. It doesn't really matter. Seems like everybody likes that color combination. And so we'll just paint right over the white. And you want to be mindful of where your other feather is when you're doing this. I'll show you on this feather right here kind of what I'm going for. I'm mainly just trying to paint the tip, so I want it to, pick a spot on there and then just bring that to the center and a little bit of an arc, and then on the other side bring that out the same way. So we get just kind of that piece. And so as you're doing a feather that's kind of overlapped, just pick you a spot and then kind of be mindful of where that neighbor feather is, so that you don't paint too much of that one. And I usually try to use natural breaks in the feather, so right there we've got a decorative cut that comes in and kind of separates these two sections, and so I usually try to use those if I can. And I have evidently spread paint all right here, but we'll take care of that. Be more careful than I am being on this. Of course, I'm not painting any differently than I usually do. Sometimes I get a little messy. Now we'll come back up here to the top and we'll do our second coat on all these. So now we're going to add a bunch of dots to this, and I would not use really watered down paint. I would use almost full strength. You can thin it a little bit, but don't thin it too much, because it's you want to leave little dots, and you want to have plenty of paint on the tip of your brush so that you can just really lightly touch the tip of your brush on the white areas of the feather, and you leave almost just like little sprinkles of color, and you can do them all different sizes and do some big, some little. I think it just adds a nice touch to these. And I try to do more closer to the tip and then just kind of fade them out going about halfway down the feather. Remember, try to do them real random. Don't try to pattern them. And you can do as many or as little as you want to. You can do some in different colors if you'd like. So now, while we're in the dot making mode, we'll go ahead and grab some white and we'll do the same thing on the, as long as these are dry. If your turquoise isn't dry quite yet, you might wait. But we'll do the same. This is already dry pretty good, so we'll do the same here. We're just going to add a few white dots. Alright, that's all we got on the feathers. Those are pretty well done. Now you could come in here and add turquoise here at the bottom as well. I would try to stick with 2 colors on feathers usually, but you could certainly do multicolored or whatever you wanted to do. I sometimes will come in here and just add just like a V-shaped band of turquoise down here at the bottom and get these little pieces that kind of wing off here. But on this one, I'm going to kind of leave it like that. I think it looks pretty cool there. But like I said, feathers are really fun. You can do a lot of different things. You could make these look like hawk feathers or even eagle feathers and do them black and white instead of the turquoise and white. There's a lot of different ways to get along with these. So you can kind of decide which one you want to do and pull up some feathers on Google and just kind of look and see what different styles you can create. And now I'm going to mix this paint just a little bit thicker now that this is dried. And I'm going to go ahead and, because we're not getting really good coverage with that, I'm going to go ahead and add just a, it's still pretty thin, but it is a little bit thicker. Try to real gently go over this. And that way we can get a good coverage on this skull. And a lot of this is happening as far as that leather peeking through. A lot of that is just because of the burnishing that we did. We kind of almost, when you burnish, you almost kind of seal that leather. So it makes it a little bit harder to cover it. But I still like to do the thin coats first because it seems to give it a quality look whenever it's done. Alright, so there we got some pretty good coverage on that. We're going to let that dry. And then we'll come back and maybe touch it up one more time. But I think that's going to be pretty good. And then we'll go ahead and antique it. We'll oil this and we'll antique it. And then we'll come back and we'll do any kind of little final touch-ups that we need to do. But for right now, the painting is done on this. And so we're going to let this kind of set up. And then we'll go back, like I said, and we'll oil it and antique it, and we'll show you that. And then I'll show you kind of what happens when some colors rub off or, you know, they kind of come off. Sometimes it looks cool. Sometimes whenever some of the paint wears off just a little bit, you get almost a vintage look to where it's kind of old. And so sometimes I'll leave that. But I will go back with a small brush and just kind of touch up here and there on some colors that I want a little bit more vibrant and to stand out. And so we'll show you that here in a minute. We'll let this dry for a good little while. I'd probably let this dry overnight if you can. And that way that paint has some real good time to cure, and then you'll have less of the paint rubbing off when you go to antique. So we'll come back to this. Okay, so we've let this dry really well. I actually let this piece dry overnight, and that way that'll usually allow that paint to really cure a little bit better. If you don't have time though, you can certainly give it like an hour, hour and a half, and you'll be all right. You just may find that some of the paint will rub off a little bit easier. But here we're just going to add a little bit of olive oil, which is what I use on all of our projects here. And so we're just going to add a light coat of that. And this is mainly just for the tooled section and to kind of even out the black. When you oil over anything you've dyed, it'll usually kind of make that dye work look a little bit better. And so we're going to go ahead and get that. Now if you notice on this piece, we do have a little bit of white here and there. I'm going to touch that up after we're done. We'll go ahead and antique it and do everything that we're going to do, and then we'll do some touch-up work. But we're going to let this oil soak in for just a minute, and then we'll seal it up and antique it. Okay, so we've given this a little bit of time here to soak that oil up just a little bit. It'll continue to dry. I just want a real light coat, so that's all we put on there. If you were going a little darker, you might let it go ahead and float out all the way before you tin coat it. That way you can go ahead and add some more oil and get this stuff a little bit darker. But I want it fairly light for some good contrast. We're going to resist this with tin coat, which is what I always use for my resist. And it works very good with paint because it doesn't strip paint. It's a very mild sealer. If you're using a lacquer-based sealer, you'll remove all the paint that you've done, even if you let it dry really well. So I would not suggest any kind of YO sheen or neat lac or any of that. I would stick with either a super sheen maybe, or an Angelus finish resist, or the tan coat. And tan coat is my preferred sealer. And so we're just going to wipe this on. And we're going to let this dry pretty well. We'll probably let it dry for 30-45 minutes, something like that, and just be sure that tan coat gets a nice good seal. The finish is not necessarily sealing the paint. The paint is a finish, and so if this thing, like say this whole thing was just solid paint and there wasn't any kind of dye or exposed tooling, you really wouldn't need to use a finish because or a sealer, because the paint is actually the final sealer. But what we're mainly sealing is this stuff here, the floral that we're going to antique. And so, you know, it's really not necessary for anything that's painted. It's more so for what you didn't paint. So just kind of keep that in mind. It's not going to hurt anything on the paint. It's just, I'm just trying to let you know that it's not really doing anything for the paint per se. So we'll go ahead and let that coat of tan coat dry. And we put a pretty good amount on there just to kind of get it nice and resisted, and then we'll let that dry really good, and then we'll go over there and antique it. Okay, so we've given this probably an hour or so to dry just so that our resist is nice and dried. So now we're going to go ahead with our dark brown 5-Bings Antique, and we're going to go ahead and antique this. And like I said, we've put the tan coat on as the resist, and now we're just going to use this antique paste, and we're just going to start smearing it on there. You've got a lot of decorative cuts in these feathers. You've got a lot of undercuts in this pattern with the skull and with this particular floral. So be sure and go in all kinds of directions, and that way you'll get good coverage down inside those undercuts and all of your knife cuts and stuff like that. You want to really spend a little time right here and be sure you're going all directions and getting it worked into all the nooks and crannies in this piece. And don't be afraid to use a lot of antique. I mean, I know it seems wasteful, but we're gonna use a good amount so that we know we get good coverage. This is what's really gonna bring those feathers to life and kind of give that skull a lot more depth. And I'm just using sheepskin scraps for the applicator. You can certainly, Lewis Leather Sales, they sell some really smaller and they call them seconds of sheepskin. They sell them for this purpose. If you don't have a local saddle maker that you can buy scraps from, if you do have a saddle maker in your area, he'll probably sell you some scraps pretty cheap because we end up with a lot of them. But if not, give Lewis Leather Sales a call and they can certainly hook you up with some really reasonable whole hides of sheepskin. Then you can cut you some of these pads out. Okay, so we've got that covered really nicely. You can tell it just looks like a real muddy mess. We've got it kind of everywhere in there. So we're going to go ahead and let that dry for just a bit. The longer you let this dry, the thicker it'll kind of stay when you go to buff it out. But it's just depending on how much contrast, how much antique you want to see. So we're going to let it dry for probably 5-10 minutes, something like that, maybe 20 minutes, and then we'll come back and buff this out. Okay, so we've given this 10 or 15 minutes here to dry. Like I said, you can certainly let it dry longer. I have had this, I've antique stuff where I've forgotten about it overnight, come back and buffed it out. It's really hard to get the antique buffed out, but it will buff out. So it's not too critical. It just depends on how dark you want the antique contrast. But we've just got a couple real clean pads here, and now we're just going to start wiping and removing all the excess of the antique paste. And you want to be as aggressive as you need to be, but not so aggressive that you buff out all your paint. So if you do see some paint come off, don't worry too much about it, but we can go back and touch it up, which we may do here. But if you let it dry overnight, you'll see, as you can see there, you don't lose as much paint than if you kind of rush it. And that's usually a lot of our problem. We're trying to rush it a lot of times in the shop because, you know, we're trying to be productive and efficient, and we've got a deadline or something. So a lot of times we don't give things the time they need to kind of cure. So we're going to kind of buff on that just a little bit. And as you can see, it's much cleaner. We've gotten all the excess off. You want to be sure that you don't have just globs of it down in these real deep undercuts and around the eyes and stuff. You just want to try to buff as much of that out as you can. But now you can see a lot more detail in these feathers, especially those finesse cuts that we do on the edge, around the outside edge of that. It just gives them a lot more life. And now these cracks that we added here into the skull, they really stand out really well. And so that's really kind of adds a lot more depth to that. And I think it looks really good. So now we'll go and we're going to put our final coat of resist on there. That's the last step, and this will be ready for any little bit of touch up that we want to do. Okay, so we're back over here at our finish table, our glue table, and we're going to add one more coat of the tan coat. This final coat is where a lot of people miss it, is that, you know, my stuff looks muddy, it doesn't have a lot of color. You can really see on this how dull a lot of this looks. You know, a lot of your tooling looks kind of muddy and a little bit dull. And so what you've got to remember is that last coat of tan coat, we've already used it once, and that was to resist it and seal it for when we did the antique. But now we're going to come back and do one more, just real light coat, and that's just going to clean off all those high areas and shine back up and bring back to life any of your tooling. It'll also brighten up a lot of this paint and clean off any antique that's still stuck on that. And it's just almost like just a final wash, and it's just going to wash that out, and that way that looks clean and it doesn't look muddy and, you know, just kind of dull. So always remember that last coat, final coat. I usually do this on a belt, like after I've put in snaps, it's completely done, and we're about to take a picture and call the customer and let them know it's finished. That's usually when I do this coat. So there you can see there how much. You can see there now how much cleaner this is, how much brighter the colors are. You've got the tooling looks no longer muddy, so that's kind of what we're going for. Now we're going to let this coat dry really good, about like we did on the other one, maybe 30 minutes, an hour, or something like that. And then we're actually going to go back, and we've got a little bit of paint missing here. You can see that bone color kind of came off here around the outer edge. That's probably more from friction. And if you like that look, like I said, sometimes it gives it a little vintage look to it. If you like that, leave it. There's not really that big of a deal. I'm going to go through and we're just going to kind of make a really light solution and just try to touch some of this stuff up. Maybe the teeth to make them look nice and bright and shiny. And then everything else I think looks okay. We didn't lose a lot of color on anything else. Maybe these purple beads here, that purple doesn't seem to stick very well, so I do have issues with that usually. But the turquoise and the white and most of the bone looks fantastic. So we're going to go ahead and touch that up here in just a few minutes, but we'll let this dry really good. All right, guys, so here we are. We're going to just touch up. As you can see right here, we've just got a little bit of some of the bone color missing right here. And so we're going to touch that up just a little bit. We're not going to get too crazy, and we're going to paint these teeth a little bit. And that's about all I'm going to do to this. I may touch up these little purple beads here. That purple doesn't really stick very good, and I don't know why, but it just kind of seems like it just doesn't hold up quite as bit. So we're going to take just a little bit. We're just going to get a little bit of this bone color. I just take the cap, just get a little bit of that, put it on our palette, and then we'll get a little bit of water. We want to do this pretty watered down because we're not trying to add another layer of paint. We're just trying to touch up. So you can see kind of how watery that is. That's pretty thin. That ought to be plenty, because all we want to do is just do a little touch up here. So we'll come in here and just real lightly. If you've got too much in your brush, just kind of wipe it out. Just be real gentle. And I'm just basically going where I don't want to go back in those cracks if I can help it, because we've got antique there, so I don't want to cover that up. And with the antiquing too, I mean, you can come in here and highlight if you need some highlight somewhere or something. You can always come back in and add these there. I find that the less of this you do, the better, but it certainly doesn't hurt. And just try to blend that in just a little bit. And remember with acrylics, like you'll see this a little bit more when it's wet. When you're putting it on, you think, man, it's going to stand out. But just give it a little bit of time and let it dry, and you'll be surprised at how much it... Because acrylics, when they dry, the color they dry in is usually a little different of a tone than when they're wet. And so that's one of the challenging things with acrylics, is because like with oil paints, you end up with the color the way it's going to dry. I mean, it doesn't change. And with acrylics, it usually tends to usually get a little darker. It's not as bright. And so here you may notice some of this paint a little more as you're touching up, but by the time it dries, you won't see it. It'll kind of blend in really well with the other stuff. So don't let that scare you when you start kind of touching up some stuff. As long as you do it thin and you don't get too crazy with it, you wouldn't want to just repaint this whole thing, because then it's really going to look different. But I think that's about right on the bone. So now I'm going to grab a little bit of white, because I want to make those teeth stand out just a little bit more. So we'll clean that brush off a little bit. Alright, last thing, we'll get those beads. This purple is really translucent, so I'm going to go ahead and use it a little more straight. Some colors you've got to fiddle with a little bit. Sometimes I have heck with them being a little translucent so they don't show up as well. So with those, you might go ahead and try to use them straight. They may already be a little too thin down, and so to speak. And then here, if you remember, we've got a little bit of white here. We've got a little smudge somewhere. Sometimes you can take your blade and just scratch a little bit. It'd be real gentle though, because you don't want to mar up the leather. So if it doesn't pop right off, don't worry about it. We're going to hit it with a little bit of dye, but a lot of times just really lightly scratching any of that will allow that dye to get in there. Sometimes if it's like a little blob of paint, it'll usually pop off of there. But I'm going to grab just a little bit of black dye. Had our little well over here that we were dyeing something earlier with. So we'll go ahead and put just a little bit of that on there. And just a little bit right there. So we'll kind of let that soak in just a minute. because we've already finished this, so it's having a little hard time getting down in there because we've sealed it. So remember, dyes strike in, paint sit on top. So it's really easy to touch up on paint, because even though we thinned it down and it does soak in a little bit, in general it's on top. So after you seal it, it's not really going to hurt anything. But with dyes, you know, they're trying to strike into the leather, and so if you've already resisted it or sealed it, you're going to have to give it a minute to soak in. And then you might get a little bit of this wet look like this. So what I'll do is I'll come in here and just very gently pick that up with a paper towel. Be very careful, because that dye will kind of move around on you. So you just want to press, and you don't want to wipe. If you wipe, you're going to spread it, and you might wipe it off, because like I said, it's still trying to soak in. I'm just trying to get any excess, because I don't want it to be obvious that we touched something up. So now you can see that that's gone now. So like I said, the goal is not to get paint where you don't want it, because you know, it's obviously you want to be as clean as possible. But if you do get it somewhere, it's not the end of the world. You can sure fix it. So, but as you can see now, a lot of this bone color has dried. I mean, just in the time that we did, since we did it, it's already dried some, and so now the color is back to normal, so it doesn't stand out now. So that's the deal with acrylics. Remember, you can touch up, just be, you know, do them kind of thin and be careful with them, and you should be fine. Try to stay out of the areas that are holding antique, like your cracks or your impressions. Try to stay out of those areas so you don't lose what the purpose of the antiquing was. But that's it, guys. That's our March tooling series. I hope y'all enjoyed this one. I know this one, we weren't planning on doing this one particularly for the quarantine with the coronavirus, but here we are killing it. You know, I mean, we ended up quarantined with this virus going on, and it's unfortunate, but it's also a very good thing that everybody's working hard as they have been to contain this and slow it down as much as possible. And I know it's adding a little bit of different structure to all of our lives, you know, especially if you've got kids, or, you know, if you don't work from home most of the time, you know, and now you're having to work from home. It's a big change. So, but we'll get through it. Everybody will make it through. We've got great leather crafters out there offering a lot of free content, a lot of things. There's a lot of projects, and we've got plenty of chance to, hopefully your shop's at home, you know, to where you have time to now to kind of work on stuff. But I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope, or all the videos. We've done 4 of them. This will be the 4th one. We're going to go ahead and put a link in the description of a final. I'm going to do a final blog post. We kind of have it all in there already, but it'll be a final post with all 4 videos posted on there, embedded into that blog post. So if you've got somebody that you think may be interested in tooling this type of pattern, or wants to get into tooling, share that link with them, and it'll give them all 4 videos and the whole deal from, and the link to the free pattern, and all that's in there. So yeah, if this is your first time watching it, remember there is a link in the description as well, so that you can go ahead and grab a PDF copy of this pattern, print it off on your own printer, transfer it to a piece of leather, and follow along with these videos and tool with us. So be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and if you get a chance, hop over to dgsaddlery.com and sign up for the Leathercraft newsletter. We've got some changes coming in the near future here with DG Saddlery, and I think you're going to hear about it. So we'll be posting something about that here pretty soon. So stay safe, stay healthy out there, and we'll see you in the next video.